Try to keep to a schedule tonight. Thank you. Bob tonight, thank you for your there you go, perfect. So not only will we get you a cab, we'll bring a group, even in Cambridge, to wider piece. I'm Brian Murphy from the Community Development Department, and I'm Brian Murphy from the Community Development Department, and want to welcome you to our first of the Cambridge Conversations community meetings. We'll be doing Cambridge Conversations throughout the month of June, both in meetings like tonight as well as in drop-in sessions. But I really don't want to spend too much time. I want to just introduce you to Catherine Madden. Catherine is the consultant who will be leading this part of our process for the Cambridge Conversations. She is a planner with a great deal of experience in planning exercises, both big and small, from master plans to small developments, and is also works at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, as well as having her own consulting practice, Madden Consulting. So Catherine will tell you a little bit more about herself and a little bit more about where we are in the process now, what we're hoping to do tonight, and what we're going to be looking to do over the next several months and indeed years ahead. Catherine?
Thank you very much, Brian. I wish I had a microphone, but I'm doing my best to speak loudly. Is Alice still here? The other day, Alice asked me if I knew Cambridge, and I answered by saying that my kids went to Dandelion and my husband worked here, and I thought that was funny. But my kids were born here. But I actually have worked and lived and studied and teach still in Cambridge. So I think I've, in the last 30 years, been all around this city, in and out of it. So hopefully I can bring some of that experience here. But I also have worked in cities all across the United States, in some very tough places, some very successful places, a lot of tough places. But you know, in all of those, the common thing is trying to get people to talk together, trying to come to some shared understanding, having that dialogue, and thinking about the future. Really, all that I do all the time is think about the future, and I hope that that's what we're going to do in this process, is find ways to think and talk about the future. Okay, let's see. So, the question, right now we're having these Cambridge conversations, and this is not yet the master plan. This is the process to set up the process for the master plan. One of the things at the Neighborhood Summit that was last Saturday, one of the things we heard from the young architect that spoke was how important it is to set the agenda for a planning process. Because really, once you set the agenda, then that kind of defines what happens. So that's what we're doing. We're setting the agenda. We're framing the issues. We're talking about what kind of master plan we want. Because the master plan is it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of hard work for the city staff, but it's a lot of hard work for the counselors. And I should recognize Councilor Mason, who is here.
And Councilor McGovern.
And Councilor McGovern, I'm sorry, yes, exactly. And Councilor Carlone, who is just coming in. Excellent. So it's a lot of work for everyone, certainly for the city staff. They love this stuff, planning. But it's also a lot of work for you all, right, in terms of going to meetings. And so we want to talk about, like, what's your role going to be? How much time, everybody's time is valuable. Not everybody wants to go to meetings all the time. So let's think about how to use everybody's time wisely. So the question is, as we start this discussion, is why are we having this discussion now? Well, a lot of this discussion is happening now because the community raised it, right? Everybody, there's been a lot of talk, actually in Boston too, in terms of wanting to have a comprehensive master plan. And the city councilors heard you. There's a council order, so there's leadership from the council, from the administration saying, yes, let's start to talk about how to do this process. The other thing, obviously I don't need to tell you all that, especially at this side of town, the pace of change is very fast right now. And when you think about it, that's because there was a recession, and now the recession is, it's over. If you look in any cities around this whole area, things are happening really fast, right? There's a lot of development going on, and I know know that that's what's happening here. Things are happening fast in Cambridge. And it's time for an update. The city is planning all the time. There's a lot of really interesting work going on in the city, which is captured on some of these boards. But it's been a while since all of that was looked at comprehensively and tied together. And so it's time for an update. Everybody realizes that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to exchange ideas. This is a very loose timeline because part of what we're doing is setting up this timeline. But, we can kind of see what's happening over the next 6 months. Sorry if I'm in people's way. But you can see where we are in this process. We're the little box at the beginning, and it's out of scale because it's really probably a 2 or 3 year long process. You can see why it's important to set it up. So we're having these conversations to get as much input as we can, but then we'll spend the summer distilling those ideas, reporting back to the city council. We want us to have a conversation about what kind of data do we need, what do we want to know before we just start generating, and then we'll start to scope out the master plan, but you can see that's not going to even happen till the fall, and then we'll launch into a proper master plan. Okay, so this is right now very open-ended discussion, and we need all the ideas that we can get. So you've seen the flyers, and I know that I've talked to some of you at Fresh Pond Day. We also, the ECOS meeting in Kendall Square. There was also a table. Yesterday we were at Millers River Apartments talking to some of the residents that live in the Millers River Apartments. So what we're trying to do is go to where people are. We're having 3 community meetings. I know this got set up really quickly for all of us, but we're hoping by having these meetings, 3 different community meetings, and then these drop-in sessions that we'll reach as many people as we can. And the drop-in sessions allow us to go out to kind of the corners of Cambridge to different places and hear from people who might not otherwise show up at a meeting, right? So they're a little bit like, yesterday's meeting was really a little bit like a focus group with the residents at Millers River. I can guarantee they probably would not come to this meeting. So, I'm sorry. Actually, Jay mentioned it was a great idea to talk a little bit about what we've been hearing about, so that you know that as you're telling us, and when I say us, I mean all of us, Iram and Stuart and Brian was there, and all the team that is at these meetings, that we're hearing and we will be distilling things, but clearly we've heard that there's a lot of concern about development around the Fresh Pond area, about traffic in this area, about density. We've also, on the other hand, heard about special places that people like the reservoir, the bike trails, always wishing for more bike trails and bike racks. We've heard about dog parks. So one kid told us we need to pull the mustard, right? Is that right? That was one of the comments. Yes, okay, so at the Millers River Apartments, though, for that group, the main thing they were concerned about was mobility, like right around their building. It was a completely different scale of interest about, so everyone is bringing a different perspective on this. Other things, creative design, I see, a lot about biking, other things that I've missed. We'll pull all this together so that we can not only hear all these things, but share them back to you. We just aren't quite there yet. I think John was asking, or someone I was talking to said, what about the legislation? What's guiding this master plan process? And in digging in, we all know that there's, enabling legislation, but in digging in, this enabling legislation was written in the 30s and last amended in the 50s. So it's really kind of a period piece, the legislation. And it's very much functional planning, like, look at housing, look at land use, look at transportation, which we can dive deep into those things. And I'm tired of that word silos, but that would be what this would mean. But obviously that would be missing the point. I mean, if you think about development that's happening, you have to look at both traffic and development and water resources. You have to look at all of that together. So we're going to try to, and it's not so easy to do, but look at how can we address those issues that the enabling legislation is asking us, but look at it in a more creative way. So there are trends. I think that other cities are looking at how do you identify cross-cutting themes. Plan YC, which is the plan for New York City, they actually looked at the different functional elements, but then they also looked at things like public food and health and some of those cross-cutting issues that were important to them as a city. There are other cities in Massachusetts that are doing things differently as well, and looking, so Greenfield, Northampton, Lowell, Somerville, looking at different ways to do this, still following the enabling legislation, but taking it to a more creative place. And, look at some of these, thinking about principles like harmony with nature, resiliency, resilient economies, equity, right? All that sort of the triple bottom line of environment, economy, and equity. So how can we talk about what's important in Cambridge, what's relevant in Cambridge? Bob, wait till I'm finished and then I'll take, right? So we want this to be not just what the law says, but what we want it to be that, but we want it to be relevant to what's important for people that live and work in Cambridge. Okay, so some of the outcomes. The question is, why do all this? Well, I think one of the things you can see is when boards and commissions have to make decisions that are one by one, you don't always get the best outcome. And so it's important then to look at, like, what's our shared understanding? What do we want it to be? How do we visualize data? How do we visualize the built environment? Come up with action items. Come up with, how do we change our policies, our rules, our zoning to capture the goals that we're after? And thinking, through this, we want to talk about who does what. We're not going to dive deep into that now, but just thinking about, in that idea of using people's time wisely, what's the role of the city council? What's the role of the city administration and the departments? What's the role of the planning board? What's the role of the residents? How do people get involved? What's the role of the institutions, Harvard, MIT, all the nonprofits, the CDCs? There's a lot going on in Cambridge, right? So hopefully you're going to give us ideas in terms of how we get people involved. I know that people get tired of outreach, right? And there's, Bob reminds me that there's never a perfect way to do outreach. But there are a lot of different ways to do it in terms of, just the intercept surveys, whether you do audience response systems. I'm not advocating any of these. I'm just saying this is some of what different ways to reach out. Focus groups, interactive online games. A lot of people, these world cafes are very popular in London and New Zealand, and Arlington just did them. Visualizing, using computer modeling to visualize what development would look like, and then online discussions. So I think what I want to say is none of these are perfect, and I'm sure that all of you have better suggestions than what all these people are doing, right? So one of the comments tonight is going to be asking, what are your suggestions for the best way to communicate? Because there's no perfect way to do it. Okay. So, and things to keep in mind. So when you're making suggestions of how outreach can work better, is how do we reach underrepresented communities? How do we that can't come to these meetings. They have kids, they have extra jobs. What are the different expectations based on experience? We have some people in this room that are very experienced in planning and processes, and we hopefully have people that are not so, that maybe are coming to a meeting the first time. So how do you design a process that addresses all of that experience? Where do you have them? Where do you have meetings? Like, we could be in a better space than this. But here we are, and we should have a microphone. How do you communicate, over-communicate? How do people get tired of meetings? What are the rules of engagement? And how do you budget for engagement, right? It's a lot of work to do process and get people involved. Some of the issues, surveys, the city does do surveys. It's interesting to see when you do a broader survey of perhaps people that are not coming to meetings. The number one, it's interesting the way this tracks, but number one issues are education, crime, and public safety, and the economy, as well as housing, parking, traffic, right? So just thinking about who's in this room and always thinking about who's not in this room and what those interests are. So, enough of me talking. So we are going to talk in small groups because the one thing about it is you pretty much can, it allows more people to have a voice, basically. So this list of questions, I apologize, is slightly different from what's on your, so I think what we're going to do is start with the second one. We're going to do them slightly out of order, so we'll go from this. So the first question is, things that we're wondering about. What should Cambridge's priorities be for a master plan? So again, starting to set the agenda for the master plan that will come. And how is that different from the area plans that have been happening? So what's the advantage of doing a citywide plan? What do you get out of that? That would be the first question. And we'll take about 15 minutes to talk about that. What's special about Cambridge? What opportunities does that offer us? One of the things that we can be doing over the summer is looking at what other places are doing, although I can tell you that Cambridge is pretty special in terms of being ahead of a lot of other cities. But still, there's always things to learn from other places. And then this question of how can you get people involved, right? So wanting positive suggestions of how you would get other people involved. What's that network? How are we going to create a network to get people involved? So the way what I'd like to do is have, there will be a city person sitting at each table, but I actually would like each table to find one person who is willing to facilitate that's not from the city, and one person who will take notes who's not from the city. And I think that you all probably have to move to it, because you know. Let's see, so does that make sense? Okay? Yeah, please. Exactly. So then we will have a general discussion, and if people could just mention like the top 3 things that came out of your discussion, right? So we're not looking for, I think what we're hoping is that in talking, you're sparking ideas, and then and help making you think about things you might not have thought about, and then sharing with a bigger group like the 3 most interesting things that came out of that discussion.
And write on your maps.
And write on your maps, because it's really fun to do that, just mark them up, go crazy. Okay, any other questions on process?
Yeah. And what do we do?
Well, someone should be taking notes.
What time?
Yeah, go.
I don't want to do that. Well, everybody else has it.
It's good. All right. These have been good conversations. And So first thing we're going to do is talk about priorities. And it would be great to capture some of the richness of the conversations. I imagine from what I heard, everyone didn't totally agree on everything. So hopefully there's some interesting things that came out of the discussions. So I guess what we're looking for would be, what were some of the priorities that your group thought were most important for the city to be thinking about at a citywide level? Why should we do a citywide master plan? What should the priorities be? And do you all want to start? Like maybe, one or two things. What was...
One of the transportation is of course a huge issue, and one of the things that came up at our table was rather than thinking in terms of how do we accommodate more cars, and forgive me, I'm doing some reading between the lines of what you said here, is also how can we change how we understand transportation? How can we design in such a way that we reduce the need
Okay.
for automobiles?
Okay, so thinking about maybe how people live and work and
Right,
and
that
shop
we
and
have
go to
areas,
school.
part of what works so beautifully currently in the city is that you have neighborhoods that are mixed use. You can, within walking distance, you can live, you can work, you can play, you can shop, you can do all of those things. You don't need to be in a car.
Okay.
And each of these, Kendall Square, Harvard Square, Central Square, where, their destinations, they have a culture of their own, they're a place to go to, they're whole amongst themselves, but they're also an attractive destination
Okay.
so that they're interrelated.
Okay, that's good. So, did everyone hear that in terms of thinking about transportation, but thinking about how we talk about land use and in terms of making mixed use neighborhoods and think differently about transportation. You can come back if we miss other things, okay? How about this table, something that you talked about that maybe was different than that? Of top priority?
Yeah.
Okay, no, just one thing right now.
Okay, we had a lot of conversation that was a little bit skewed. But I would say one of the other main things we wanted to look at is how to look at
And yes, we can collect people's notes also, but
Yeah.
I mean, does
Sorry.
anyone want to help? Just even one thing, it doesn't have to be the be all and end all.
Yeah, well, one of the big issues was how to have a planning process that everyone feels comfortable with. The neighborhoods are so very different. One neighborhood might need something, one neighborhood might need something else, and the planning process is going to take a long time. How does that help the neighborhoods that are in need right now?
Right, okay. So thinking about the needs
Sort of
of
thinking about
each
the big
neighborhood.
picture, but also the small
Right.
issues that are going on in
Sort of
each
patchwork.
neighborhood now, so that everyone feels comfortable with the process and progress
And
of the master
progress.
plan.
Okay,
Right.
progress is a great one.
Because we sort of calculated out what your numbers were about when the master planning was projected to be done, and then we thought when it actually might be implemented, and we all weren't sure we'd even be around for that.
In my lifetime, I always
Right, we all said the same thing.
I will tell you an aspiration that I always have, which is part of the main point is to be having the discussion and that you learn things. We all learn things through that process. So it isn't all about getting to the end. It's what we learn, and things can start to change sooner, right? So I want everyone to focus on the 2 years. Hopefully, we will start having it sooner. Something from this table.
We talked about a lot of stuff, but I'd like to say that I think what several people said here was that master planning is not just one thing. It's integrating a whole lot of other things, because when you plan with just one thing in mind, if it's just housing, just commercial, just something, are going to fail because it's all interconnected, and a master plan helps to realize that interconnectivity and helps to get it beyond just one thing, narrow focus.
Right, that interconnected, and how to break that complicated thing down in a way that is going to be interesting.
Well, no,
Keep it interconnected.
it's not just one thing. It's the realization that it's all connected, and one thing affects another thing. Planning.
And this table, one thing.
Okay.
Prepared, set to go.
Sorry, okay, so I'm being told to tell you 3. We have a loving city that's close.
Can you rise again? We can't hear you.
Okay, we have what one person described as a loving city with lots of opportunities for people who know each other to bump into each other, see each other in different parts of the city. We also have a city that has amazing green spaces, the river, the parks, all of those things. Well, it's a good balanced scale. It's not too dense. It's dense, but it's not too dense.
Okay. So, any priorities that you come up with out of that?
I think keeping affordability, transportation, and preserving the possibilities of having the squares where people can come together and feel like they know their neighbors and they know each other.
Okay, so I actually it's interesting, a couple people mentioned that in terms of the role of the squares in connected places. Okay. This table, yeah. Yes, please.
We saw an opportunity to build community specifically in the quad, in the triangle, and in the quarter areas, including schools, open space, civic centers, libraries, just to build areas that kind of lack a sense of cohesive community now.
So schools, open space, library.
Yeah, those are elements of building community in these
Right.
areas.
Okay, sort of kind of a civic infrastructure that's missing.
In the quad, and the triangle, and the quarter.
Right. Okay. That's good. Right. Yes, this
Many of the things that people have said we loved, especially transportation that deals with alternatives to cars. But housing, especially we have people who grew up here, who want to be able to live here, raise their kids here, have their friends who grew up here, raise their kids here. So we need housing more than just the market and luxury housing that's being built. We need a lot more affordable housing that goes up into middle income, and we have to find funding streams for those.
Okay. And where that housing would be?
What?
And where that housing would be?
That housing would be everywhere we can find places to put it, especially in neighborhoods that perhaps don't have as much affordable housing as those that do, but everywhere.
Okay. So finding more places for people to live and people with different incomes?
Yes, and have that income diversity. We talked about it at our high school as a past element, not necessarily as a present one. We want that income integration where people and racial integration where people get to know and live among people who are different from them.
Okay. I think that's good. That defines a lot of what makes Cambridge special. This table.
Spokesperson. So I'm going to just say 3 things that I think haven't been covered. We had a long discussion about what we like about Cambridge, and that is being able to walk, having the parks that we do have, being able to have public transit, being able to shop and have your life where it feels like a town. The thing that we would like, one of the things we'd like changed is the whole process of notification for zoning changes, for licensing, for the planning board, how that all works for the city's calendar, the website getting easier. It's the whole thing. It's whether it's zoning or anything else, a much better way to just go to the web and be able to know what's going on. And then we also had a whole bunch of things about public transportation and what could be done to make it better.
To make it better, right?
That I don't think has been said.
Right, I would think, yeah, let's see. One thing, and tell me if I'm not saying it right, but one thing that they mentioned was, I think they call it, but the whole kind of the way the city operates. I mean, in terms of like the mechanics, I'm thinking of Boston as that urban mechanics, in terms of how notifications go out, how people know what's going on, the zoning, the planning board.
It's everything. So, for example, you look at the department.
Yeah, maybe Stan.
It's everything.
Project.
So, for example, you have to go to the city's calendar, and then you have to open up a PDF file, and you have to know the location rather than the name you might call it in the neighborhood. And if you go to one spot, you still have to go back to the calendar and do a hunt or call someone up in the city.
So that whole, kind of communication and operations.
There's going to be a major issue that affects everyone, like a major zoning thing. People need a way of knowing about it, because I certainly don't read the Cambridge Chronicle. Sewer separation. One more thing. Sewer separation was a wonderful example of a great outreach by the city. That I've been in 2 neighborhoods that have dealt with this, my older one and my current one, and the city has been wonderful. At least our table feels this way on the way the city has done the notification on sewer separation.
Okay. So that's good to know. So we look at that. Still on that process. The other thing that you mentioned was just transportation, was the public transit. Is an important thing that could work better. Okay. And I think, please.
The environment, like the environment.
Yeah. Okay.
Not giving developers the opportunity to build on floodplains.
Okay. Okay. So the environment and protecting floodplains and wetlands. Well, wetlands are pretty well protected, and floodplains and future floodplains. Yes. Wait. I'm sorry.
Well, one
Go ahead,
thing
Lynn.
I thought is also we mentioned climate change and just anticipating what are, that you can't plan based on what we have now, but we already know that there are numerous shifts that are coming at us rapidly.
Right.
And that, we need to take that into consideration. We can't just assume that Cambridge is going to putter along nicely the way it is right now.
Right.
It's not.
Okay. So climate change and the future environmental changes.
The aging population, the demographics are changing, the economics of the country are changing as a whole.
That's a great point.
There are a lot of big picture issues. We're in a very, very volatile and rapidly changing phase of development of the whole country, the whole planet, and we need to think bigger than just Cambridge in a lot of ways.
Exactly. That's a great point. Let me have you please speak. Yes, and then I'll come back to that.
We at our table, Councilor Mark McGovern said that there's a distinction between building places for people to live and building neighborhoods, and that this is a concern about the development at Alewife in Fresh Pond, and he explained that there was a 10-year-old will of the city to attract investment for housing in Cambridge 10 years ago, and we said, all of us, that now is a time, since the property values have gone up and the whole situation is going to be more profitable anyway, to negotiate. We said we can change the rules and bargain to negotiate with those owners who 10 years ago were told that, the sky's the limit, you can do anything you want, and now I think we can start putting in some stuff as long as we're all together on it and we're reasonable and we understand that property is sacred, they bought the stuff and so forth. But now we have a different Cambridge with different needs, all the new changes and the new people, and we want to make sure that we are building a neighborhood and not just places to warren, partly because Cambridge is going to be a world-class city area along with Boston if we do it right. And what we have to hang on to is this sense of neighborhood and interaction and Andrea Wilder said that there should be green pathways to link the whole thing so that people might not have to take their car, at least the young and the fit, could be pedestrians and use bikes, and that each link should link up to get to a different destination. And I had the idea that if we had non-exhaust emitting smaller buses that would run more often, so people like myself with gray hair who wouldn't have to take their car to go shopping and come back with the package. And Andrea said that we should have an emerald necklace like the one that Frederick Law Olmsted was, had the original idea. And that's also, he worked on Fresh Pond Park, so that I'm talking basically about Alewife and that area.
So that's nice. That ties together a lot of what people have said in terms of, if we think about developers do invest in their property, and that helps create new housing. But how do we also ask for, as that investment is happening, is making sure that both the private new development is matched by the civic realm, by the parks and the networks of parks and libraries you mentioned over here, and schools, so that we're really building places. But I think one thing that you mentioned was important is that there are a lot of global forces that are happening at the same time. And as we look at the master plan and think about what kind of data we need, it's important to understand those economic cycles, the climate change trends, and how do we look at how all this goes together. Yes.
There's no such thing as predicting economics.
Coordinating not just within this developing aspect of the city, but really making it coordinate with the other cities and towns around us.
So regional coordination. A few more points, and then I want to get to the process things. Yes?
One of the other things we brought up was all of these sort of strings of neighborhoods being important, that they all also not only have civic and housing and affordable housing, but that there's also retail and support systems in place so that people don't have to use their cars as much, so that it's easier for people who don't walk farther. So,
Yes, that's great. Exactly.
Neighborhoods that don't have the full support that
Right, and that affects the mobility. I think here, and then John.
Yes, one of the ideas at our table was a moratorium on development until the master plan is actually completed, because otherwise it's all going to be happening.
Right, but we talked about that. I think that there's ways that change can happen. We don't have to wait 2 years to have change happen. So let's talk about, as we go forward, how that happens. Yeah.
Well, with the idea of data, I mentioned that I had gone to a transportation camp, and that there are apps where you can put in your variables. Like if you add X number of residential units and 0.5 cars, that you can predict what's going to happen to the traffic. And that it seems that any new development should take place in the 21st century, and run the numbers through these programs so you'll say, oh, it might do this, and you actually will have the data about what's going to happen
modeling
and what the impact is going to be on the environment.
And maybe modeling bigger systems.
Yes.
Right. Yes. And then John, and then I want to answer the last question. We're almost out of time. Yes.
We were talking about a suggestion that had been made on one of the discussion groups about car-free development, which kind of goes along with this green emerald necklace, that if you live in a place where there is a lot of alternative to where you might have a bike hub and a T-station and bike paths and connections to things and retail and community, that maybe you could have some developments that say, this is a development that you can live in and not have a car.
Which is starting to happen.
So very briefly, our group's bullet points. Climate change, analyze transportation. 2 is just too long for a process, but is also far too short to be effective. There's a huge problem. I'm fast. Okay, there's a huge problem with assessment of plans. How do we know we've achieved compliance with the plan and ensure that we measure and assess and continue to manage the plan going forward? North Cambridge needs a more effective street structure. What we have was not designed. We need to stop being car-centric. We need to level the playing field between developers and citizens, and that needs to be facilitated by the city and CDD. Is this process an amusement, or is it actually going to be an effective process going forward? Many master planning processes in the city from 1960 onward have not been effective, so make sure this is different. There are regional transportation issues, both auto and transit. And lastly, what's special about Cambridge, you ask for us? Diversity, scale, people, smart people, educational system, young people, trees, third-generation Cambridge families, and the historical local economy. Next.
And that's the email you're going to send me, right?
If you like.
I want to just transition, and we'll come back and you or you can answer this question. What John said is a lot of these plans are not effective or effective. So how are we going to make this one different, right? So how is this going to be effective? And that gets to the process question. So how would you get people involved, and by extension, how would you make this a better process? Because this is just, yes.
I would assume that at some point down the road when things start getting critical, the people who are investing in the infrastructure, particularly the housing and commercial space, will start applying the pressure that they know that they can apply. And at that point, the public will lose a lot of influence. That's kind of what I would expect as sort of the flow of events. I understand what you mean.
So, I'm sorry, does that answer the question, how can we make this process better? How can we get more people involved? Are you suggesting?
I'm suggesting there's a pitfall ahead of us when it becomes important for the commercial interest to have a bigger influence. And we need to retain our ability to manage the process.
Okay, and that maybe gets to John's point of leveling the playing field somewhat. Okay, are there other suggestions for a process? Chief, do you have a question besides PowerPoint, which I know that you don't know?
I think it's a very important thing when we have to speak in difficult conditions.
Yeah.
Like the noise in this place, that everybody stand up, speak as loudly as you can, articulate well, because otherwise what you say will not be heard. It's tremendously important. We should have at the next meeting.
We will.
Microphones.
We will.
Better acoustics.
I agree.
A bigger screen that we can read.
A microphone.
I know, a huge screen, we live for that. Do you have a comment? And then I'll come to make sure it's over.
We had an idea that you could hold competitions, people's ideas for like demonstration projects, and maybe with some funding attached. And that also that it could be done through the public schools.
Right, so demonstration projects, right? That's it, but in competitions. Did you have other ideas?
We had two ideas. One is getting transients that go through Cambridge involved in the process as well. And then also if neighborhood organizations could get some funding, because there could be more conversation within each neighborhood. And then a general note, we only got to that question at the very end because we were all very skeptical about the master planning process. So it seems like before going forward, there has to be a certain amount of something going on, clarity going on why there's a master planning now, why, how it's going to help everyone.
Yes, and can I just say, these conversations help us understand that, so thank you.
Can I clarify point one? Was my point. Transit did not refer to
Please stand up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Transit referred to people passing through. Exactly. The young professionals, 20-somethings, who live in apartment buildings, renters, etc. That they
And people who travel to stay on driving.
Somebody, you brought up the possibility of a moratorium while this process is going forward, and you had a response saying that might not necessarily be necessary. I think as part of this process, to me, it's important to understand how we might need to protect the process or shape the process by considering things like a temporary moratorium in certain areas. And so I think that can be understood as part of the process, figuring out where we all think maybe we should be on some of that.
Okay? Yeah. I want to make sure I'm not forgetting people over here, so just holler if I am.
Yeah.
Well, yes, go ahead.
Just even though summer's coming, they have a few more of these, my guess is if it's crops, how well attended they might be.
Okay, I just wanted to express one thing that the Vice Mayor said, which is in terms of trying to do outreach that would bring in a different set of people that are in this room, specifically a more diverse audience, maybe some of the recent immigrants, and also a younger audience. Sorry, folks. It sometimes helps, maybe if you think about how you're framing the questions. Cambridge Conversations is fairly broad, and as Lang said, if you advertise it as, focusing on the sort of crisis or the challenges or all of that, you get one sort of person, and if you talk about, needs for affordable housing or education or anything like that, you get a different set. So maybe varying the message to different populations, and also, I would say different times of day. You're doing the drop-in, but this is a difficult time for younger people with young children.
I just wanted to quickly add to that, we have an amazing pool of talent in our city, particularly young people in our high school. And we have obviously a lot of challenges to face, and I think it's important to give our young people those challenges, and make them a part of this conversation, and tell them, we have traffic challenges, we have climate change challenges, and you can meet those challenges. So, let's tap, the intellect and resources we have right here in the city.
I agree. Definitely. We need to get out more. Mark.
Excuse me. Just some sort of practical things. We have in Cambridge something called the Community Engagement Team, which is a group of workers that go out. They speak multiple languages. They are from various cultures, and they go out into underrepresented communities and try to get people involved. We use it a lot in the schools and try to get people involved. So that we should be accessing them for this. We did, right? So get them, and again, childcare, even transportation for some people. It's very easy for me to get here from Central Square for this, but if I'm somebody who is in public housing, who has to worry about a babysitter and food and everything else, I'm not going to get here. And also just the location. I think we are doing these in different parts of the city, but some of these should be taking place, some of these conversations should be taking place in housing developments as well.
Yeah, we're trying. And everything we learned from this, we can continue in the fall. You had a comment.
Hi. The Mid-Cambridge neighborhood, they had a bulletin that they used to put up notices, like Ice Cream Social, and I used to read it, even though I wasn't living in the neighborhood, but that might be something useful so people will know about what's going on in the city, like meetings or the master plan planning, because not everybody uses email. I mean, yeah, it was a bulletin board, and they would hang these notices. And a lot of people walk down my street, and you could just put one on my fence, and that would be fine, so they will know what's going on.
So a networked community would be everybody helping to get that word out. That's a great idea. Not a yes.
This is labor intensive, but I think just the old town shoe canvassing.
Yes.
And I know some cities have neighborhoods who have a particular representative who's in community development, or so they know who to contact in the system. There may well be, but we don't know at this point. So
Right. And we are interested, as the council said, to work with the community engagement team who does some of that kind of organizing.
I think very consistent canvassing.
So we're almost out of time, but if everyone's okay, I'll take a few more comments. Yes.
It's a different topic.
Okay, go ahead. Yes.
So what I want to say has to do with just the community and not so much the outreach right now, but things to do with recycling, banning plastic bags, just community protection, environmental protection, things like that. Composting, things like that, so we don't generate so much trash, since we're going to have so many more people living here.
Okay. So on the priorities is being aware of waste disposal, trash and waste disposal issues. Yeah? Okay. That's great.
Did someone put infrastructure up there?
Infrastructure
Previously,
priorities.
we were talking about.
Okay. Yes. I think you might have to stand up. Oops. Try to project.
The very street that we're on, if you read the street sign, it says this street was previously called Great Swamp Way. We are basically sitting in what was once a swamp, and the water table is rising, the floodplain is and will expand. What are we doing about making sure that the things that are being built are going to withstand that? What are we going to do about getting flood insurance? All that. I mean, we're going to have big water issues at some point in the future.
Okay, that's a great point. Yeah.
Save the Silver Maple Forest. And talking about outreach, one of the ideas was the city already produces a number of things like Dennehy Park and the June Dance Party. For the city to undertake an overarching theme that would be neighborhoods, so that every event that the city produced for a certain amount of time would be to do outreach into the neighborhoods, to get neighborhood groups together, to have them have these kinds of little focus things with this information, so that the city's already planning the events. They already have their systems just to give it a theme while we're working on these issues.
Okay, that's a great suggestion. We are out of time, and we will, and it's great to have all this input. I know that I can keep going, but I'm going to honor everybody's time, and we will also keep trying to make things work better as we go. But I appreciate everybody's input. I think what we need to do is we will collect the maps, which are so beautiful. If people have notes that they want to contribute, Minji's collecting them. We are working as fast as we can to get co-urbanized up for those of you who do like to work in an online community. You can email this address, which comes to all of us, and you can call Sweetie or me. And thank you very much.